October mornings in Millbrook Valley carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. But the autumn of 1834 felt different from the start. The air hung heavier than usual, clinging to skin like damp wool, and even the cheerful preparations for Eleanor Whitmore's wedding couldn't lift the strange melancholy that had settled over the Pennsylvania countryside. Eleanor had been the pride of Millbrook Valley since childhood, graceful, intelligent, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that made traveling merchants linger an extra day in town and prompted marriage proposals from as far away as Philadelphia. But Eleanor's heart belonged to Jonathan Crawford, whose family owned the prosperous farm adjacent to the Whitmore estate. Their engagement had been announced in spring, celebrated with a grand party that drew visitors from 3 counties. The wedding, planned for October 15th, promised to be the social event of the year. Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's father and owner of the largest grist mill in the valley, spared no expense. He hired musicians from Baltimore, ordered champagne by the crate, and transformed his estate's ballroom into what guests would later describe as something from a fairy tale. But it was Eleanor's wedding dress that captured everyone's imagination. She had traveled to Philadelphia in July, accompanied by her mother Margaret, with the specific purpose of finding the perfect gown. Most local brides made do with their Sunday best or commissioned the town seamstress, but Eleanor insisted on something extraordinary for her special day. If you've ever had a strange experience with clothing or objects that seem to have a life of their own, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more spine-chilling historical tales. Eleanor returned from Philadelphia with a dress that left the entire town breathless. Made of pure white silk that seemed to shimmer with its own light, the gown featured intricate beadwork that formed delicate patterns across the bodice. Pearl buttons ran from the high collar to the fitted waist, and the 6-foot train was embroidered with what looked like tiny stars. The sleeves were long and fitted, ending in points over Eleanor's hands, and the veil, nearly 12 feet of the finest Brussels lace, had been crafted to complement the gown's ethereal beauty. "It's like something a queen would wear," breathed Sarah Mills, the postmaster's wife, when Eleanor allowed a few close friends to see the dress during its final fitting. Eleanor herself seemed transformed by the gown. During the weeks leading up to the wedding, neighbors noticed changes in her demeanor. The lively young woman who had once delighted in afternoon rides and social calls became increasingly withdrawn. She spent hours alone in her room, and when she did appear for meals or family gatherings, she seemed distracted, as if listening to something only she could hear. Margaret Whitmore attributed her daughter's behavior to pre-wedding nerves, but privately worried about Eleanor's increasing obsession with the dress. The young bride checked on it multiple times each day, adjusting its position in the wardrobe, smoothing non-existent wrinkles, and speaking to it in soft whispers that Margaret couldn't quite make out from the hallway. "She treats that dress like it's alive," Margaret confided to her sister Clara during a morning visit. "Yesterday I found her sitting beside the wardrobe, just staring at it with the strangest expression." Clara, ever practical, dismissed her sister's concerns. "All brides are nervous, Margaret. Remember how you fretted before your own wedding? Eleanor will be fine once the ceremony is over." But Margaret's unease only deepened as the wedding day approached. Eleanor had begun talking in her sleep, long conversations that sounded like responses to someone else's voice. When Margaret pressed her ear to Eleanor's bedroom door, she could swear she heard 2 distinct voices, though she never saw anyone enter or leave the room. 3 nights before the wedding, Eleanor's behavior became even more peculiar. She began wearing the dress for hours at a time, claiming she needed to break it in so she would be comfortable during the ceremony. Margaret would find her daughter standing motionless in front of her mirror, still as a statue, the dress pooling around her feet like spilled milk. "Eleanor, darling, you'll wrinkle the silk," Margaret would say, but Eleanor seemed not to hear her. On those occasions when Eleanor did respond to her mother's voice, her answers came slowly, as if she were speaking from a great distance. Her eyes, once bright with laughter and warmth, had taken on a glassy quality that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of the porcelain dolls in Eleanor's childhood collection. The wedding preparations continued, despite Margaret's growing concerns. The estate buzzed with activity as servants decorated the ballroom with white roses and golden ribbon. The kitchen staff worked around the clock preparing an elaborate feast, while groundskeepers ensured every garden path was perfect for the guests who would stroll the estate after the ceremony. Jonathan Crawford visited daily, but even he noticed Eleanor's strange behavior. During their conversations, she would suddenly stop mid-sentence and turn toward her bedroom, as if someone had called her name. When Jonathan asked what she had heard, Eleanor would blink in confusion and claim she hadn't heard anything at all. "She's becoming someone else," Jonathan confided to his friend William Hayes, son of the local minister. "It's as if the Eleanor I fell in love with is fading away, being replaced by I don't know what." William, a practical young man studying for the ministry like his father, suggested that Eleanor was simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of her approaching wedding. "Marriage is a big step, Jonathan. Perhaps she's having second thoughts?" But Jonathan shook his head. "It's not cold feet, William. There's something else. Something about that dress." Jonathan's observation proved more accurate than he knew. On the night before the wedding, Margaret decided to check on Eleanor one final time before retiring. She found her daughter's room empty, the bed unslept in, but the wardrobe door stood open. The wedding dress was gone. Panic seized Margaret as she searched the house, calling Eleanor's name in increasingly desperate whispers. She didn't want to wake the entire household and cause a scene on the eve of the wedding. She checked every room, every closet, even the cellars and attic spaces. Eleanor was nowhere to be found, but as Margaret passed her daughter's room for the third time, she froze. Soft humming drifted from behind the closed door, a melody Margaret didn't recognize, haunting and wordless. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard rustling fabric, like silk moving against silk. The humming continued, occasionally broken by whispered words Margaret couldn't understand. Margaret tried the door handle, but it was locked from the inside. She knocked softly, calling Eleanor's name, but the humming only grew louder, drowning out her voice. When she pressed her eye to the keyhole, she saw white fabric moving in the candlelight, but couldn't make out Eleanor's form clearly. Eventually, exhaustion forced Margaret to her own bed. Though she slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of empty wedding gowns dancing in moonlight, dawn arrived gray and misty, with clouds that threatened rain. Margaret rose early and immediately went to Eleanor's room, finding the door unlocked and her daughter sleeping peacefully in her bed, still wearing her nightgown. The wedding dress hung in its usual place in the wardrobe, pristine and untouched. When Margaret asked about the previous night, Eleanor looked at her with genuine confusion. "What do you mean, Mother? I went to bed early and slept wonderfully. I had the most beautiful dreams." Margaret decided not to press the issue. There would be time to discuss Eleanor's nocturnal wanderings after the wedding. For now, she focused on the day's preparations, pushing her worries to the back of her mind. The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity. Guests began arriving by mid-morning, filling the estate with cheerful conversation and the rustle of their finest clothes. The musicians tuned their instruments in the ballroom while servants made final adjustments to the floral arrangements. Eleanor seemed more like her old self as she prepared for the ceremony, chatting with her bridesmaids and laughing at their jokes. But when it came time to don the wedding dress, her demeanor changed completely. She dismissed everyone from the room, insisting she wanted a few moments alone to compose herself before the ceremony. Margaret reluctantly agreed, though she stationed herself just outside Eleanor's door in case her daughter needed assistance with the intricate buttons and laces. From the hallway, she could hear Eleanor moving about the room, the whisper of silk, and occasional soft words that sounded like a conversation. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The guests grew restless in the ballroom. and Jonathan began pacing nervously near the altar that had been constructed at the far end of the room. The musicians played the same gentle pieces repeatedly, waiting for their cue to begin the processional. Finally, Thomas Whitmore climbed the stairs to fetch his daughter. Margaret watched anxiously as he knocked on Eleanor's door, calling her name with increasing urgency. When no answer came, he tried the handle and found it locked. "Eleanor, Eleanor, answer me." Thomas's voice carried down the hallway, causing several guests to look up from the ballroom below. The silence from behind the door was complete. No movement, no sound of breathing, nothing. Thomas threw his shoulder against the heavy oak, and after several attempts, the lock gave way with a splintering crash. The room was empty. Eleanor's everyday clothes lay neatly folded on the chair where she had left them. Her shoes sat beside the bed, her jewelry scattered across the dressing table as if she had been deciding which pieces to wear. The window was closed and latched from the inside. There was no other way out of the room. The wedding dress was gone. Thomas and Margaret searched frantically, tearing apart the wardrobe, looking under the bed, checking every corner of the room for some clue to Eleanor's whereabouts. Other family members joined the search, then the wedding guests, and finally the entire household staff. By evening, search parties with lanterns were combing the woods around the estate. Jonathan Crawford led one group along the creek that bordered the properties, while other men searched the roads leading away from Millbrook Valley. Dogs were brought in to follow any scent trail, but they seemed confused, circling Eleanor's room and whining as if they could detect something humans could not. The search continued for 3 days without success. Eleanor Whitmore had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, taking with her only the mysterious wedding dress that had so captivated and changed her in the weeks before her disappearance. It was young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's apprentice, who provided the first clue to Eleanor's fate. On the 3rd night after her disappearance, Timothy was walking home late after helping to repair a broken wagon wheel. The path from the village took him across the stone bridge that spanned Millbrook Creek, and as he approached the bridge in the misty darkness, he saw a figure standing at its center. Even in the dim light, Timothy immediately recognized the elaborate wedding dress. The figure stood perfectly still, facing downstream, the dress's long train spread behind her like spilled cream. The intricate beadwork caught what little moonlight penetrated the clouds, creating tiny points of illumination across the bodice. "Miss Eleanor?" Timothy called out, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a tentative step onto the bridge. "Miss Eleanor, is that you?" The figure turned slowly, and Timothy's breath caught in his throat. The face beneath the Brussels lace veil was pale as winter frost, with dark hollows where Eleanor's bright eyes should have been. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound emerged, but her lips moved as if she were trying to form words. Timothy took another step forward, but the figure began to retreat, gliding backward without seeming to move her feet. As she reached the far end of the bridge, she turned toward the woods, and Timothy saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The back of the wedding dress was stained with what looked like dark watermarks, as if Eleanor had been standing in the creek for hours. By the time Timothy reached the end of the bridge, the figure had vanished into the tree line. He ran the remaining distance to his home, where he spent the night huddled by the fireplace, afraid to sleep. When Timothy reported his sighting the next morning, most people dismissed it as a trick of moonlight and mist. But over the following weeks, similar encounters began to accumulate. Mrs. Hannah Burke saw Eleanor standing in her garden at dawn, bending over the flower beds as if picking roses that weren't there. Samuel Torres spotted her walking along the main road through town, her dress pristine despite the muddy conditions. Each witness described the same disturbing details: Eleanor's unnatural pallor, her silent movements, and the dark stains that seemed to spread across the white silk like slowly blooming flowers. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, deep and empty, as if Eleanor were looking at something far beyond the physical world. Jonathan Crawford refused to accept these reports as mere hallucinations. Driven by desperate love and an unwillingness to believe Eleanor was truly lost, he began his own investigation into her disappearance. He spent his days following up on every sighting, his nights waiting in places where Eleanor had been seen, hoping to encounter her himself. His vigil was rewarded 3 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance. Jonathan had positioned himself near the stone bridge just after sunset, armed with a lantern and a loaded pistol, not because he feared Eleanor, but because he wasn't certain what other forces might be at work in the darkness. As the church bell in town struck midnight, Eleanor appeared. She materialized from the mist that rose off the creek, her wedding dress as luminous and perfect as it had been on her intended wedding day. But as she drew closer, Jonathan could see the changes that death, or whatever had claimed her, had wrought. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, and her auburn hair hung limp and dark around her shoulders. "Eleanor," Jonathan whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "My darling, where have you been? Everyone's been searching for you." Eleanor's head turned toward the sound of his voice, but her movements were slow and mechanical, like those of a clockwork doll winding down. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from very far away, carried on the wind like an echo. "I cannot leave," she said, the words barely audible above the sound of water flowing beneath the bridge. "The dress, it won't let me go." Jonathan took a step closer, extending his hand. "What do you mean?" "Eleanor, come home with me. Your parents are sick with worry." But as he reached toward her, Eleanor's form began to shimmer and fade around the edges. "I tried to take it off," she continued, her voice growing even fainter. "But it's part of me now. The threads have grown into my skin. The pearls have become my bones. I can never remove it." "That's impossible," Jonathan protested, but even as he spoke he could see the terrible truth in Eleanor's hollow eyes. "The woman who sold it to me," Eleanor whispered, her image flickering like candlelight in a draught. "She knew what it would do. She collects brides, Jonathan. She adds us to her collection one by one." "What woman?" "Eleanor, you're not making sense." But Eleanor was already fading, her white dress growing translucent in the moonlight. "Find the others," she said, her voice now nothing more than a sigh carried on the night wind. "Help them before it's too late." With those words, Eleanor vanished completely, leaving Jonathan alone on the bridge with only the sound of the creek and the echo of her impossible warning. Jonathan staggered back to the Whitmore estate, where he shared Eleanor's message with her parents and the local constable. Though they struggled to believe his account, the desperation in Jonathan's voice convinced them to investigate Eleanor's trip to Philadelphia and the mysterious seamstress who had created the cursed dress. Margaret Whitmore had carefully preserved all of Eleanor's correspondence and receipts from the Philadelphia journey. Among the papers, they found the address of the dress shop, 47 Cobbler's Lane, in the oldest section of the city. The receipt bore an elaborate signature, Madame Evangeline, couturier of dreams. Thomas Whitmore, Jonathan, and Constable Williams traveled to Philadelphia the following week, armed with Eleanor's receipt and a description of the mysterious dress. But when they arrived at 47 Cobbler's Lane, they found only a narrow alley lined with abandoned buildings. The landlord of the nearest occupied structure claimed no dress shop had operated in the area for decades. City records showed no business license for anyone named Evangeline. It was as if the woman and her shop had never existed at all. Frustrated but undeterred, the men began making inquiries at hotels, restaurants, and other dress shops throughout Philadelphia. Their persistence finally paid off when they encountered Mrs. Rebecca Morrison, proprietor of a small but respectable dressmaking establishment near Independence Hall. "Evangeline?" Mrs. Morrison repeated when they described the mysterious seamstress. Her face grew pale. "You're not the first to ask about her. Other men have come here, looking for wives and daughters who disappeared after buying dresses from that woman." Mrs. Morrison invited them into her shop's private parlor, where she served tea and shared a story that chilled them to the bone. Over the past 5 years, She had been contacted by at least a dozen men from various cities, all searching for missing women who had purchased wedding dresses from someone matching Evangeline's description. "The pattern is always the same," Mrs. Morrison explained. "A beautiful young woman engaged to be married travels to an unfamiliar city seeking the perfect dress. She encounters Evangeline, though the woman apparently uses different names in different places, who offers her a gown beyond her wildest dreams." The men listened in growing horror as Mrs. Morrison continued her account. "The dresses are always white, always incredibly beautiful, and always fitted perfectly despite never having proper measurements taken. The women become obsessed with their gowns in the weeks before their weddings, spending hours wearing them, talking to them, caring for them as if they were living things. And then they disappear on their wedding days?" Jonathan asked. "Every single one," Mrs. Morrison confirmed. "And afterward, there are always sightings. The missing brides wandering in their wedding dresses, unable to rest, unable to remove the gowns that have somehow fused with their bodies." Mrs. Morrison had begun keeping a record of these cases, hoping someday to find a pattern that might lead to Evangeline's capture. She showed them a leather-bound journal filled with names, dates, and locations spanning from Maine to Georgia. Catherine Morrison of Boston disappeared April 1830. Lydia Briggs of Savannah disappeared June 1831. Amelia Price of St. Louis disappeared September 1832. The list went on, each entry representing a life lost to Evangeline's impossible dresses. "What is she?" Thomas Whitmore asked. "What kind of person could do such things?" Mrs. Morrison shook her head. "I don't believe she's a person at all, not anymore. The oldest account I've found dates back to 1798, a bride named Mary Hutchins who vanished in Providence. Even if Evangeline was young then, she would be an old woman now. But every witness describes her as ageless, neither young nor old, with eyes like black glass." The men returned to Millbrook Valley with Mrs. Morrison's journal, carrying the weight of Eleanor's tragedy and the knowledge that she was far from alone in her fate. They shared their discoveries with the local minister, Reverend Matthew Hayes, hoping that prayer and divine intervention might somehow help Eleanor find peace. But Eleanor's appearances continued, growing more frequent as autumn deepened into winter. She was seen throughout Millbrook Valley, standing in the cemetery among the headstones, walking the main street at dawn, lingering near the church during Sunday services. Children began having nightmares about a sad lady in white who wanted them to come and play with her. The most disturbing incident occurred in early December, when 10-year-old Mary Miller woke to find Eleanor standing outside her bedroom window. The child's screams brought her parents running, and they arrived to find frost covering the glass despite the relatively mild temperature, and small handprints pressed against the window from the outside. Mary claimed Eleanor had been trying to tell her something, moving her lips urgently behind the glass, but no sound had penetrated the window. The little girl was so traumatized that her family moved away from Millbrook Valley before Christmas, unwilling to risk another encounter. As winter settled over the valley, Eleanor's manifestations became more aggressive. She began appearing inside buildings, in the general store, the church, even private homes. Witnesses reported that the temperature would plummet whenever Eleanor appeared, and that she seemed to be searching for something, moving restlessly through rooms and corridors as if following a scent only she could detect. Dr. Edmund Morrison, the town physician, theorized that Eleanor might still be alive somewhere, existing in some kind of suspended state that allowed her spirit to manifest while her physical body remained hidden. He organized several expeditions to search caves, abandoned buildings, and other places where Eleanor might be unconsciously sheltering. But the searches yielded nothing, and Eleanor's appearances grew more desperate. She was seen clawing at doors and windows, her mouth open in what appeared to be silent screams. The beautiful wedding dress showed signs of decay, tears in the silk, stains spreading across the fabric, beadwork falling away like tears. On Christmas Eve, as the entire population of Millbrook Valley gathered for midnight service, Eleanor made her most dramatic appearance yet. She materialized at the back of the sanctuary, just as Reverend Hayes began his sermon, walking slowly down the center aisle as the congregation sat frozen in their pews. Eleanor's condition had deteriorated terribly. Her wedding dress, once pristine and beautiful, now hung in tatters around her emaciated frame. Dark stains covered the white silk, and the elaborate beadwork had mostly fallen away, leaving bare threads that caught the candlelight like a spider's web. But most horrifying of all was Eleanor herself. Her face had become gaunt and hollow, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice filled the entire church despite being barely above a whisper. "I cannot rest," she said, her words echoing off the stone walls. "The dress binds me to this world, but I belong neither to the living nor the dead. I am trapped between, forever wearing the gown that was meant to bring me joy." The congregation sat paralyzed as Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Others will come after me. The dresses call to lonely hearts, promising eternal love and perfect happiness. But love cannot exist without freedom, and we are slaves to the cloth that covers us." She turned to face the assembled townspeople, and many later swore they could see through her translucent form to the altar beyond. "Do not let others suffer as I have suffered. Find Evangeline. Find her before she claims more brides. Stop her before the collection grows too large for any power to break." Eleanor raised her hands, and the congregation could see that the dress's long sleeves had grown into her arms, the fabric and flesh becoming one. Pearl buttons had embedded themselves along her spine like a second skeleton. "The dresses are hungry," Eleanor whispered, her voice fading as her form began to dissolve. "They feed on hope and love and dreams of happiness, and when they have consumed all of that, they feed on life itself." With those final words, Eleanor Whitmore faded away for the last time, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the memory of her warning. Jonathan Crawford devoted the rest of his life to hunting Evangeline and her cursed dresses. He sold his farm and used the money to travel from city to city, following rumors and reports of similar disappearances. His search took him as far as New Orleans and Boston, but Evangeline always stayed one step ahead of him. In some places, Jonathan found evidence of the seamstress's presence: abandoned shops with bolts of unusual fabric, witnesses who remembered a pale woman with ageless eyes. But by the time he arrived, Evangeline had always moved on, leaving behind only empty buildings and the lingering sense that something unnatural had passed through. The Whitmore estate stood empty for years after Eleanor's disappearance. Margaret and Thomas, broken by grief and unable to bear the memories that filled every room, moved to Virginia to live with Margaret's sister. The grand house fell into disrepair, its windows dark, its gardens overgrown with weeds. Local children dared each other to approach the abandoned manor, claiming they could see lights moving through the empty rooms and hear the sound of music drifting from the ballroom where Eleanor's wedding should have taken place. Some reported glimpsing a figure in white moving through the upstairs windows, endlessly pacing the corridors in search of something that could never be found. In 1889, more than 50 years after Eleanor's disappearance, the Whitmore estate was finally sold to developers who planned to demolish the decaying structure and build modern homes on the land. Workers began the demolition in early spring, but their progress was immediately hampered by a series of disturbing discoveries. Eleanor's bedroom, though the house had been abandoned for decades, showed no signs of decay or deterioration. The wallpaper was as fresh as the day it had been hung, the furniture gleamed as if recently polished, and the mirror still reflected images with perfect clarity. Most unsettling of all, a wedding dress lay spread across the bed as if waiting for someone to wear it. The dress was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of age despite having been abandoned for over half a century. The silk was still white as fresh snow, the beadwork intact and gleaming, the pearl buttons fastened as if Eleanor had just finished dressing for her wedding. The construction foreman, a practical man named James Sullivan, ordered his workers to remove the dress and burn it along with the other debris from the house. But when two of his men attempted to lift the gown, they reported that it felt ice cold to the touch, and seemed to resist their efforts, clinging to the bed as if it had grown roots. One of the workers, Patrick O'Malley, later claimed that as he grasped the dress's bodice, he heard a woman's voice whispering in his ear, "Please don't take me away. I've been waiting so long for her to come back." O'Malley released the dress immediately and refused to touch it again. Sullivan, growing impatient with his men's superstitious behavior, decided to handle the matter himself. But when he reached for the gown, the temperature in the room plummeted so dramatically that his breath became visible, and frost began forming on the windows, despite the warm spring weather. As Sullivan's hands closed on the silk fabric, the dress suddenly burst into movement, billowing and swirling as if caught in a violent wind. The workers fled the room, and Sullivan soon followed, claiming he had seen the dress take on the shape of a woman for just a moment before collapsing back onto the bed. The men sealed Eleanor's bedroom and continued demolishing the rest of the house around it, but they refused to enter that one room again. When the job was complete, Eleanor's chamber stood alone among the rubble like a strange monument to obsession and loss. Eventually, the developers hired a different crew to handle the remaining structure, but these workers also reported strange phenomena. The temperature around Eleanor's room remained unnaturally cold. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations, and several men claimed to see a woman in white watching them from the windows of nearby houses. Finally, the developers decided to leave Eleanor's room intact and build around it. They constructed a small park on the site, with Eleanor's bedroom preserved as a gazebo-like structure in the center. A plaque was installed explaining the historical significance of the site, though it made no mention of Eleanor's supernatural fate. For several years, the preserved room became a minor tourist attraction. Visitors would come to see the mysterious wedding dress and hear the story of Eleanor's disappearance. But the attraction was short-lived. Too many visitors reported disturbing experiences. Children would refuse to enter the structure, claiming they could hear a lady crying inside. Adults emerged pale and shaken, describing sudden drops in temperature and the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. Some reported seeing their own reflections move independently in Eleanor's mirror, while others claimed the wedding dress shifted position when no one was looking. By 1895, the local authorities decided to close the site permanently. Eleanor's room was boarded up, and the dress was sealed inside with warnings posted to discourage trespassers. But even these precautions couldn't contain Eleanor's restless spirit. Reports of sightings continued throughout the late 1800s and into the new century. Eleanor was seen walking along country roads, standing in fields of wheat, and lingering near other young women on their wedding days, always in her deteriorating gown, always searching for something she could never find. The last documented sighting of Eleanor Whitmore occurred in 1934, exactly 100 years after her disappearance. A young bride named Susan Mitchell was having her wedding portrait taken at a photography studio in the nearby town of Greenfield when she noticed a pale woman in an old-fashioned wedding dress standing behind her in one of the photographs. The photographer, examining the image with a magnifying glass, confirmed that no one else had been present during the session. The figure in the photograph was translucent, visible through Susan's own image, and appeared to be reaching out as if trying to touch the living bride. Susan Mitchell kept the photograph for the rest of her life, claiming it served as a reminder that some promises, once made, can never be broken, even by death itself. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to locate the exact site of the former Whitmore estate, but county records from the 1800s are incomplete, and the area has been heavily developed over the decades. Some believe the land was deliberately obscured to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing whatever might still rest beneath the earth. Local historians maintain that Eleanor's story serves as more than just a ghost tale. It's a cautionary reminder about the dangers of obsession and the price of seeking perfection in an imperfect world. Whether Eleanor Whitmore found peace or continues her eternal search remains unknown, but her legend lives on as a warning to those who believe that happiness can be purchased, worn, or possessed. The story of the bride who never left her wedding dress continues to resonate with people today. particularly young women approaching their own wedding days. In an age of elaborate ceremonies and perfect Pinterest weddings, Eleanor's tale reminds us that true happiness comes not from the dress, the decorations, or the ceremony itself, but from the genuine love and commitment shared between two people. Perhaps that's the real lesson hidden within Eleanor Whitmore's tragic story, that in our quest for the perfect wedding, we must never forget the imperfect, beautiful, and ultimately human nature of love itself. If this spine-chilling tale gave you goosebumps, smash that like button and subscribe for more terrifying historical mysteries. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and whether you or anyone you know has ever experienced something supernatural involving clothing or personal objects. Your stories might just become our next video.